So in this section, we're going to look at captions specifically and how we make meaning by the interaction between images and text on a page. And then we're going to take a look at it in action, and we're going to kind of dissect a piece from a newspaper and look at all the levels and how they've been put together. So the placement and style of captions is going to help in terms of space on the page, but also in terms of how we understand what we read. Now, not everyone's going to be attracted in the same way to images and text. Some people are going to kind of be drawn to the image and then look at the text to support it. Other people are more text dominant and they're going to read the text in order to then understand the image. So you need to be aware of both ways of approaching your content when you decide what works best for you. This is an example from the book. So the proximity, how close physically the caption is to the text, it's going to make them understand those two things are linked. It's also convenient in terms of depending on how you make sense of it. Sometimes it's not the best use of space, and that's something that you need to balance when you are figuring out how you're going to place things within a composition. The other thing to keep in mind is how not just how close it is in terms of making us understand, but do you want to overlap, as we can see here? Do you want there to be a signifier such as the square where the image overlaps that? Or is it just going to be in terms of nearness? And as you can see here, this is turned to the side. Is it in keeping with the rest of the text? So again, you want to make it clear when the caption is different from the body text. Or if someone is text dominant, this is going to be easier for them to approach all of these three and be pulled into. But in this case, if someone's text dominant, reading right to left, top to bottom, this suddenly jars them and pulls them out in a very distinct way. It's going to pull them out of the narrative. And so you need to be conscious of that and the way that this might be better for you in terms of space, but is it achieving what you want it to achieve? So we need to think about these problems in terms of how it impacts meaning. And that's kind of what I mean about approaching it editorially. Are the captions essential to understanding? If so, you need to keep them close to the pictures. If it's more about you need citation, you need to document, then okay, it might be fine to sacrifice how close it is. So let's look at how captions are used throughout, as well as all the other levels of meaning making are used through this particular 2-page spread from a newspaper. And it is in another language, and part of that is that we should be able to understand the levels of hierarchy and what's happening in this newspaper spread without being able to understand the words. That's actually how you can tell if the design works or not. So let's walk through what this designer has done in order to make these things make sense. So here's a closer look at that spread. We've got the image kind of central, spanning the 2 pages. We've got all the different kinds of media that's circling the guy's head. And then we've got various levels of what seem to be 2 different stories that relate to this central image. So we've got the body text. Now, just to remind us in terms of what our alignments are and what this means, it's set justified and it's set in a serif font. So that's going to really evoke a classic newspaper feel, and it's going to make it easier and quicker for people to read that main body content. So again, justified means that the right and left are both even, they're both flush, and it's using the serif, which if we're talking about print reading, is going to be quicker for that small body text for us to understand and read. Now we've got this little pull quote. Pull quote being part of the body text that's usually repeated and pulled out so that maybe in a newspaper, for example, or magazine, you read that and that pulls you into the story. If, say, you only read the lead, you're not sure whether or not you want to read on, that pull quote should be something interesting to be like, ooh, actually I want to read on. Now, they've set that larger in the same font as the body text so that way we know it's related to the body text. We know it's been pulled from the body text. but they haven't set them justified. It's got a rag on the right. Now that gives a more naturalized feel, a looser feel, and it gives a little bit of contrast, as well as the size giving contrast to the body text. So we know it's a little bit different. Now we've got our header and the subheads we've got for our kind of two parts of the story. Now, we've got all of these guys are in a sans serif font. Now, this visually relates to the serif font that they use in the body, so it feels like it should go together while still having the contrast between the serif and the sans serif. Now, what do I mean by the fact that they are structurally related? Okay, let's zoom in a little bit on this text. This is in the sans serif. We've got the subhead here. Look at the O for Obama. Now look at this O at the beginning of our serif body text. If you lay them on top of each other, they would more or less align. So they have structural similarities. There are certain things like, if you look at the A in the sans serif, it's the type of A that has a top and a bowl here, in the same way that if you look at the A down here, again, you have that top curve and you've got the bottom bowl, versus, say, the way this uppercase A is more geometric. So you want there to be pieces that feel like they come from the same place. We can see an example here pulled out where you can see this is from Lupton's book. So again, what I was saying about the A here having that top and bottom versus this A, which is very circular. So in this case, these two don't feel like they'd go together as well. This is a bit more geometric, and so this kind of works a little bit better. There is still a lot of difference, though, between these two. One of the ways that things are the same, though, is the way the G has that little tuck in here, whereas here we're kind of missing it, but this is more about the upper part than the tuck in. So think about the ways in which these go together. And again, this one's got a little bit more ornate going on, and the way that this is more ornate than, say, this one is. And so these two feel like they go a bit together. So think about how there can be structural similarities between your serifs and your sans serifs to make them feel like they should go together while still having contrast. So now we're going to use now we're going to take a look at these little pull areas inside the kind of the different social media and other electronic media that they're pulling out. So contrast between the serif and the sans serif is partly going to be through scale, the fact that these are always going to be larger, well, in the header and subhead, not so much here, and also weight, kind of bold. So while we have that similarity in structure, there's still contrast because we need contrast to be visually appealing. So using the sans serif for the captions allows it to be really readable when reversed out. So one of the things that we talked about when you have a dark background and white type is that things can break up a little bit because ink does pool. You know, when you have paper, the ink gets absorbed by the paper. If you have really fine serifs, it's much easier to read black text on white than the opposite. You need to add more space. You need to add something larger. But the sans serif isn't going to break up as much because there isn't as much to break up. You don't have those little pieces. So they've used it here in a smaller size in order to get the effect out of the caption that they're looking for. And it adds to the contrast. Now, we've got these guys up here kind of reference our pull quotes by being set flush left. Now, we also have hyphenation inside of our justification down here. And when we have our headers, you don't want to hyphenate words as much as you possibly can, unless it's a word that has a hyphen, like pull quote or subhead. When you have your headers, you want to make sure that you keep words intact as much as possible. And that's, again, for the ease of reading for the reader. So the weight of the text, the fact that it's bold, allows all of this to feel very solid, despite the fact that it's ragged on the right. And the only way you can achieve solid on both the right and the left is if you hyphenate. It just doesn't work otherwise. So we want that rag, but we want it to still feel really solid in terms of your header because, again, you want the most attention to be drawn there. So we can see that they've paid really close attention to where they break their lines in order to achieve this. So as you can see on the left here, things kind of go sentence structure, sentence structure. On the right, we've got this colon and we've got this kind of very short word and then a little bit longer. So rather than break it based on line length, they've broken for sense. Similar to how we usually do when we're looking at something that's centered. But they've clearly paid a lot of attention to how it's going to look cleanest, how it's going to make the most sense. And they've decided that in this subhead, you break by line length, but in this one it's broken for sense. Now we've pulled the serif back in up here in this kind of caption for the image. And again, that allows for some contrast, even if these are the same size, because they are different fonts. This has also been set in all caps. And so there's a similar visual weight to the headers and subheads, but it's still contrast because we've got it in a serif versus a sans serif. Now, our captions inside our little Twitter, Facebook, email, etc., those are going to be flush left, but they wrap to the circle, which is kind of an interesting added level of difficulty. So clearly there's paid a lot of attention to the rag in order to have it look really natural within the shape. And you can see the way that it works in, say, the Facebook is a little bit different from the way it works from that cell phone. And the use of a subhead within that caption with the type of media we're talking about, Twitter, text, Facebook, etc., gives the reader a little clue along with the icon as to what's about to follow. And those are set in all caps just like the image caption is. Again, you've got these little references to each other. Last but not least, we have the running text at the top and bottom. We've got, again, our mix. So the page is set in the serif, top and sans. So we've got this kind of balance between the serif and the sans serif. Now the serif font is visually closer to the body text and the sans serif is closer to the headlines. So the fact that we've got the top where the headers live set in sans serif kind of, again, reinforces that, whereas down the bottom, it's physically closer to the body text, and so it's set in the serif. So again, it's reinforcing, everything reinforces itself, which is why this is such a great example. So I just want to close with a reminder that we want this visual relationship to reflect the actual relationship between the elements on the page. So we're talking about photos, captions, tables, diagrams, notes, headers, subheaders, whatever it is. We want it visually to reflect what the actual text is trying to communicate. So think about those relationships between those elements. Literally make a list like we did in the last example of looking at a recipe. What are the various pieces of information you need to convey? What level, what importance are they? And then how do you want to think about expressing that visually? So images interact with body text, they interact with captions, they have to sit within everything else you're looking at. And similarly, each part of the text should reference the other parts of the text. Nothing should be an island unto itself. So things that aren't body text, headers, footers, captions, it's important to signpost to the readers what kind of information they're going to be looking at. You should know if you're looking at a caption to an image or if you're looking at a subhead. Remember Ellen Lupton's words, that one of design's most humane functions is to help the reader avoid reading. How are you going to make it clear if someone's looking at something that's in a different language, not even in a human language, something made up, what importance the elements on your page have? And so in our next project, we are not going to be using words at all. So again, we're going to need to think about how we can achieve meaning through using those relationships between the elements in order to make that meaning. Thank you for coming on this journey with me.